Inside the Visitors Information Center at Gettysburg. The electric map that will show battlefield positions, how the battle ran, and so on. Perhaps I can film it while it's in progress.
Your present position is indicated by the white light on the map. The town of Gettysburg is north of us, about 1 mile. Note that the map is oriented as marked along its edges. Near the end of June, part of the invading Confederate Army passed 25 miles beyond the town of Gettysburg. Now, on July 1st, the whole army, led by General Robert E. Lee, was converging from the west and north. General George Gordon Meade, commanding the Northern Army, moved his forces in from the south of Gettysburg. He had been ordered to stay between the invading Confederates and Washington, D.C., the capital. Therefore, when the Battle of Gettysburg started, the Northern forces came in from the south, and the Southern forces came in from the north and west. The first troops to arrive were Union forces. They came in from the south, passed through the town of Gettysburg, and scattered out in line of battle, leaving 2 brigades in reserve. The reserve brigades are resting at the cemetery near our present location. Then the Confederates began their attack, first from the west and then from the north. The Confederates advanced and struck the Union line in this fashion. Today, the Eternal Light Peace Memorial stands at about the center of where this July 1st fighting took place. The commander of the Union troops that opened the action, General John Reynolds of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, was killed at this spot, only 52 miles from his home. He was succeeded in command by General Abner Doubleday, the man who ordered the first shots to be fired from Fort Sumter more than 2 years earlier, marking the beginning of the tragic Civil War. The important thing to note here is that the Confederate line was longer than the Union line. It overlapped the ends of the Union position. The right flank of the Union line at Barlow Knoll, in particular, was in danger. Finally, the right end of the Union line crumbled. Then the remainder of the Union forces on left and center were dislodged and compelled to fall back along this line. The Confederates continued to press the Union men and drove them through the streets of the town of Gettysburg. The Union line continued to fall back until it reached the point where the reserve troops were waiting. And then, with their assistance and the cover of the ridge, the retreat was halted and the line reorganized. The Confederates pursued, but did not again attack on the evening of the 1st of July. Instead, they were content to reorganize their line in this manner. And as the campfires began to appear behind the lines the night of July 1st, the two armies occupied these positions. To sum up the first day, the Union forces were driven back through the town of Gettysburg, a distance of nearly 2 miles, and the retreat ended here, where we are located, on what is called Cemetery Hill. In the meantime, the Confederate commander, General Lee, arrived on the field and made his headquarters here. General Meade, the Union chief, arrived and made his headquarters there. Meade's headquarters is just about 600 yards south of the visitor center, our present location. During the night, a few additional campfires appeared behind the Confederate line, out along the Chambersburg Road, indicating the approach of the head of Longstreet's column. Lieutenant General James Longstreet commanded the First Corps of the Confederate Army and was a trusted friend and confidant of General Lee. His approach would not have been as consoling to the Confederates if they could have seen the great number of additional campfires springing up in the Union rear, indicating the arrival of many more Union forces. This buildup of Union power took shape throughout the morning of July 2nd. As the campfires winked out behind the lines, the newly arrived Union troops moved into position along the front. No fighting had occurred during the night of the 1st or the morning of the 2nd, and that is the appearance of the two lines as they approached the first fighting on the second day at Gettysburg. The 3rd Corps of the Union Army, under General Daniel Sickles, advanced to a new position ahead of the Union position. When Sickles reached that point, he received word that Confederates were moving from the west. This was Longstreet moving in. Sickles' line was spread out in this way. An angle was formed in the line at the famous Peach Orchard along present-day Business Route 15, the Emmitsburg Road, the road to Washington. The left of the line rested at a large ledge of rocks called the Devil's Den. Longstreet is ready. His men come forward in line of battle from Seminary Ridge. He opens by advancing his right toward Big Round Top, the large hill at the southern end of the battlefield. Big Round Top held no immediate importance because it was wooded and too rugged for artillery. The smaller hill to the north, Little Round Top, had recently been cleared of trees. It became a key position at Gettysburg. If the Confederates had occupied this hill, the smaller one, they may well have won a victory at Gettysburg because, from the crest, their guns would have commanded all of the ground between our present location and Little Round Top. The man who is sometimes called the savior of Gettysburg, General Gouverneur K. Warren, rode to the hill and realized its importance. When he saw the Confederates coming, he rushed a brigade of 1,300 men to guard it. And just as the brigade was positioned, the Confederates struck in this fashion. The one brigade checked them until another arrived. Then the two brigades stopped the Confederate advance and compelled them to fall back into the valley. In the meantime, additional Confederate units were moving in. The Union forces in Devil's Den were driven back into the Valley of Death. The Union forces in front of these Confederates were driven back across the wheat field. 7 Union brigades plunged in and regained the wheat field. 4 of these brigades are the same 4 that were back here. They plunged into the front line as reinforcing units. These Confederates were supported by sharpshooters posted among the rocks in the Devil's Den area. The sharpshooters were picking off the Union men on Little Round Top, including some of the prominent Union officers on the southern end of the field. Now Longstreet sent the remainder of his column forward. His entire column was in motion. It had left Seminary Ridge and was pressing towards Cemetery Ridge. Union reserves were quickly pushed in there to plug the hole in the line. General Sickles, commanding the Union left, was at this point when his right leg was nearly torn off by a Confederate shell. The one-legged officer outlived all the other Corps commanders who fought in the battle. Sickles died in 1914, 51 years after he lost his leg on this field. Longstreet's Confederates continued their advance. They swept through the peach orchard and drove the Union line back in this fashion. The Union forces in this sector were driven out, and Longstreet's troops moved into the wheat field, fought their way through the wheat field into the Valley of Death, and launched another assault on Little Round Top. But again they were stopped when they bumped into that little hill. The farthest advance of that particular portion of Longstreet's column is marked by the little stream in the Valley of Death, which became known as Bloody Run. In the meantime, the left of the attacking column, part of A.P. Hill's corps, had swept the Union line back to Cemetery Ridge. They were stopped because of that ridge, and because the Union reserves, many of them from the right of the line, were rushed forward. They went into line of battle along the ridge, bolstering the line, stopping Hill's advance and compelling them to turn back. The right wing withdrew first. Then Union troops struck the center to the edge of the wheat field, where they stopped. The wheat field stood between the two lines, now a bloody no man's land. This little green light indicates the location of a portion of the 1st Minnesota Regiment. During the action we have just covered, this one regiment attacked and stopped 2 brigades, but lost almost 70% of its men engaged. Most of the losses were suffered in about 15 minutes. The Confederates in that sector were in open fields. With the advance stopped, they couldn't stay out in the open, so they fell back, first along this line, and then back to the protection of Seminary Ridge. These Confederates on the right stayed in their advanced position. They were protected by trees and rocks. That ended the fighting on the southern end of the field during the second day. We move now to Culp's Hill, the right flank of the Union Army. We are here. Culp's Hill is 3/4 of a mile east of this visitor center. Spangler Spring is located at the base of that hill. Most of the Union troops on Culp's Hill had been withdrawn. They were among the troops that went out to help stop Longstreet, leaving just this one brigade to guard the hill. The evening of July 2nd, 3 Confederate brigades moved against one Union brigade, fighting behind rock and log barricades. The Northern soldiers could not be dislodged, but the Confederates found light resistance on the south slope of the hill. They moved into the empty trenches of the withdrawn Union troops, and then the Confederates stopped. One could ask, why did they stop? They had moved against the hill late in the evening, and the falling of darkness hampered their movement over unfamiliar ground. Also, in those days, communications depended on daylight. Somebody on foot or on horseback carrying a message. Then, too, they were afraid the Union forces might be retiring deliberately, baiting them into a trap. Uncertain, they decided to wait until daylight. During the night, the Confederates were reinforced by 4 brigades. But the pause in the battle was fatal. It gave the Union officers time to return all of their troops and to add reinforcements. On the morning of July 3rd, the last day at Gettysburg, the Union position was too strong, and the Confederates had lost their chance. The battle at Culp's Hill was renewed about 4 in the morning on the 3rd day. They hammered each other for 7 hours, in what some called the bloodiest fighting of the war. About 11 o'clock, the Confederate officers, realizing that it was a waste of life to continue the conflict, ordered their men to withdraw, and in breaking off the engagement, ended the threat to the Union right flank. That brings us to Longstreet's assault, popularly known as Pickett's Charge, considered by some the turning point in the 4-year American Civil War. The attack occurred in the afternoon of the last day at Gettysburg. The Confederates withdrew from Culp's Hill at 11 in the morning. From 11 until 1 in the afternoon, the field was quiet. Lee was preparing the stage for one of the great infantry charges of history. Meade, anticipating that another assault would be made, was preparing to repulse it. They were juggling positions. Finally, the two armies were in position along these lines. Lee maneuvered nearly 12,000 men into line of battle. Keep in mind that we are located here. The center of the Union line became known as the high water mark, meaning the high tide of the Confederacy, the high point of the Confederate military achievement. After Gettysburg, the tide of the Confederacy receded. The Union center was separated from the Confederate attacking column by almost a mile stretch of open fields. 12,000 men were going to cross those open fields. Longstreet was fearful. He doubted its chance of success. But Lee knew they were running low on supplies on unfriendly soil and must have the victory which had seemed so close in the last 2 days. He decided that the gain would be worth the risk. Some 150 cannons on Seminary Ridge opened fire upon the Union center. Many of the trees in the grove at the corner of this building were blasted to splinters. A few minutes later, over 100 Union guns here along Cemetery Ridge answered. For 2 hours the hills shook during the thunderous barrage. Then the Union officers, believing that the assault would soon follow, ordered their guns to stop firing in order to prepare for it. The Confederate officers, noting the break in Union fire, thought that the Union line was demoralized. A reluctant nod from Longstreet was the signal that sent 12,000 men, rank upon rank, with banners waving, marching across open fields. They didn't rush at first. They marched. The Union guns were silent, waiting. And then suddenly these 12,000 men discovered they were facing a roaring volcano. The Union guns had reopened. The Confederates continued marching until they reached this point. Then they halted, reorganized, and rushed in the face of cannon loaded with canister, like giant shotgun shells. Still they came. Finally, butternut brown uniform melded with the blue in a bloody hand-to-hand conflict. The lines became entangled. Thus did the divided nation drain its own lifeblood. Brothers fighting brothers, each for the cause he thought was right. 50 minutes. 50 minutes. And the greatest infantry charge in our history was history. Of the 12,000 men who started the charge, over half did not come back. In Pickett's division alone, all but 3 of the field officers were dead or wounded, including 3 generals. Entire regiments disappeared. Fewer than 1,000 of Pickett's soldiers answered the next morning's roll call. Note that the Confederate attack was split into 2 columns. the main column here. The smaller column, confused by the smoke, attacked slightly to the south. Two Union regiments, consisting of troops from the state of Vermont, daringly advanced into the gap created in the Confederate lines. They wheeled to the right, facing north, and raked the flank of a larger Confederate column. Then the Vermonters did an about-face, fired south, and tore up the flank of the smaller column. These two small regiments effectively demoralized the flanks of Longstreet's two columns. The Confederates fell back to Seminary Ridge. The final maneuver at Gettysburg occurred 5 miles east of the main battlefield. Several brigades of Union cavalry under General David M. Gregg were patrolling those fields. One of these brigades was commanded by a 24-year-old brigadier general, George Armstrong Custer, who would later make a last stand against the Sioux Indians in Montana, the Battle of Little Bighorn. Lee ordered the famous Confederate cavalryman Jeb Stuart, who had come onto the field from the north, to swing around the Union right to a position behind the Union Army, to have his cavalry in position behind the Union lines when Pickett's troops broke through. There would then be infantry in the front, cavalry poised in the rear. Lee intended to use his cavalry to complete the Union route once Pickett broke through. But Stuart ran into trouble. When he reached this area, he was spotted. He came into line of battle to find the two Union brigades blocking his front. He sent forth his first units as snipers and skirmishers. One of the Confederate brigades ran out of ammunition and was compelled to withdraw. The remainder of the Confederates advanced and were caught. The Union troops were firing on them from 3 different angles. Stuart, hampered in his movement, ordered the Confederates to withdraw. He left the field to the 2 Union brigades and retired. The last Confederate thrust at Gettysburg had been made. The high water mark had been reached. Though the war would bleed on for 2 more years, the Confederate cause, for which her sons had fought so bravely, was doomed. The following day, July 4th, the 2 armies sat, facing each other, nursing their wounds. During the evening of July 4th, in a pouring rain which must have reflected their mood, Lee, Longstreet, Ewell, Hill, Stuart, the entire Confederate Army started the withdrawal that ended the bloodiest event to ever take place on the American continent. 51,000 soldiers, Americans all, 30% of the armies involved were casualties in the 3 days of bitter fighting. We direct your attention to the shape of the Union line, the famous fishhook formation at Gettysburg. If you keep a picture of the fishhook in your mind, you can better understand the battlefield when you make your tour. We are located where the hook begins to bend. It bends through the National Cemetery, back over Copp's Hill, with the point of the hook near Spangler Spring. The shank, or long end of the hook, begins here at the Visitor Center and follows south, along the crest of Cemetery Ridge, past the high water mark, Vermont Monument, Pennsylvania Monument, Minnesota Monument, Little Round Top, and ends at Big Round Top. Keep this in mind, and you can keep your directions in order as you tour the battlefield. battle on the evening of November 18th, President Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg for the dedication of the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Now, with the armies far away in Virginia, the lights of the town and farmhouses burn throughout the countryside. The President spent the night at the David Wills residence. Here he completed the final draft of the speech he was to deliver the following day. The next morning, November 19, 1863, as the few thousand people that were to share in one of the greatest events of history were gathering on the streets of this little town, Lincoln emerged, mounted a horse, and rode to the cemetery using the road that passes in front of this building. Amid the neat rows of freshly dug graves and a few carefully chosen phrases of dedication, he defined for all Americans the lesson of so much bloodshed. The world, he says, can never forget what they did here. It is for us to highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
This completes the night program. Before leaving, please check for all personal belongings you may have left behind. Please leave the auditorium for the